Imagine the scene. A sunlit kitchen in 1940s Italy. The comforting aroma of baking fills the air as Leonarda Cianciulli serves crisp, sweet tea cakes to her neighbors. But this is no simple act of kindness. This is a ritual, a mother's desperate attempt to protect her son, baked with an ingredient you won't find in any cookbook. Because the secret to that perfect crunch wasn't just sugar and butter. It was the rendered fat and ground blood of her latest victim. This is the story of a collection of women queens, countesses, and housewives who history has branded as monsters. From blood-soaked thrones to body-filled farmhouses, their actions have forged our darkest legends. They wielded power poison and prophecy with terrifying results, leaving a trail of death that defies simple explanation. So, how does a mother's love curdle into culinary homicide? How does a queen's piety ignite the executioner's pyre? And were these women truly unique freaks of nature, or were they the final inevitable products of a world that pushed them past the breaking point? It turns out the curse that created these female monsters wasn't demonic. It was a man-made cocktail of power pressure and poison, brewed by the very societies that claim to fear them. And the most terrifying part, that recipe has never gone out of style. Before we dissect these cases, tell us in the comments which female monster from history fascinates you the most. Your verdict might change by the end. Now subscribe, and let's unlock these cursed chambers. Before we open the individual case files on these women, we must first perform an audit of the systems they operated within. To understand the monster, you must first understand the design of the cage. Every society runs on a kind of cultural source code, a set of rules, expectations, and acceptable transactions that define the baseline of normality. For the women in our files, this code was written with patriarchal ink on the parchment of tradition. It was a world of defined roles and limited options, where a woman's value was calculated with brutal simplicity. And it is here in the seemingly ordinary that the conditions for extraordinary horror were first established. On the surface, the world these women inhabited was governed by principles that seemed entirely reasonable, even virtuous. The primary function of a high-born woman was transactional. She was the living seal on a geopolitical contract, a vessel for continuing a bloodline, the human collateral for a peace treaty. Consider Lucrezia Borgia. From a young age, her life was a series of strategic placements. Her marriages were not personal unions. They were chess moves made by her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother Cesare, to consolidate power across Renaissance Italy. The language used to describe these arrangements was one of honor alliance and dynastic duty. Lucrezia wasn't being sold, she was being invested. Her compatibility wasn't with a husband, but with a political objective. This was the system working as intended, a woman's body as a tool of statecraft. Her personal desires an irrelevant footnote in the grand ledger of power. For women of royal blood, piety was another key performance indicator. A queen's devotion was a reflection of her kingdom's moral health. Mary Thermard of England came to the throne with a reputation for unshakable Catholic faith, a quality initially seen as a source of stability. In a world fractured by the Reformation, her adherence to tradition and the one true faith was presented as a promise of order. Her personal virtue was meant to be the nation's virtue. In the domestic sphere, the rules were just as rigid. A woman's domain was the household. Her responsibilities were management, child-rearing, and maintaining the social and moral fabric of the family. Her power was indirect, exercised through influence and the quiet management of her sphere. On paper, this blueprint seems stable, structured, and entirely normal for its time. It's a system built on concepts of duty, lineage, and honor, words that sound reassuringly solid. But every system contains the seeds of its own corruption. Every rule has a loophole. And the very structures designed to contain and define these women would soon provide them with the tools for their terrifying ascent. The temperature was comfortable, but the pot was on the stove. The first shift occurs when the tools of a woman's prescribed world are repurposed. The change is subtle, almost imperceptible, because it happens within the accepted boundaries of their roles. The kitchen, the center of domestic life, begins its transformation into a laboratory. For centuries, women were the keepers of herbal knowledge, brewing remedies for colic and fevers. But the same hand that measured out chamomile could also measure out something else. Suddenly, the language of healing, a tonic, a remedy, a sleeping draught, becomes a perfect alibi for the language of murder. This is where Mary Ann Cotton and Tilly Klimek enter the historical record. The key that unlocked their potential was not a dagger or a pistol, but a cheap, ubiquitous household product, arsenic. Sold openly as flypaper or rat poison, it was the perfect weapon for a woman. It required no physical strength, mimicked the symptoms of common illnesses like gastric fever or dysentery, and was a standard item in any well-managed home's inventory. The warm bath phase is defined by this quiet weaponization of the mundane. A caring wife could administer a slow poison over weeks, her concern masking her crime. A grieving widow could collect condolences from the same neighbors who never suspected her pantry held the murder weapon. Simultaneously, new systems emerged that inadvertently gamified mortality. The birth of the life insurance industry in the 19th century was a modern, rational financial tool designed to provide security. But for women like Mary Ann Cotton and Belle Gunness, it transformed a husband or a child from a loved one into a financial asset with a fixed value. The cold technical language of actuarial tables and premium payments provided a new sterile logic. A death was no longer just a tragedy, it was a liquidity event. A decision to take out a small policy on a sickly stepchild could be framed as sensible financial planning. The act of murder was hidden behind a veneer of bureaucratic prudence. In this warming water, the old roles are given a sinister new potential. Tilly Klimek's kitchen became a stage. She didn't just cook for her husbands, she prophesied their deaths to her neighbors, cloaking her murderous intent in the accepted superstitions of her community. Her reputation as a psychic provided the perfect cover. Who would suspect the woman who saw the future of actively creating it? The mechanisms of control were still subtle, operating under polite labels. Prudent provision, folk wisdom, a woman's intuition. But the consequences were becoming increasingly and invisibly fatal. The temperature rises sharply when individual hidden crimes are scaled up and legitimized by the machinery of the state and the church. The violence is no longer a secret kept in a teacup. It is now a public policy executed with bureaucratic efficiency. The defining characteristic of this stage is the replacement of personal choice with impersonal process. A form, a decree, a theological ruling now does the work that a poison bottle once did, but on a terrifyingly larger scale. Here the piety of Mary I transforms from a personal virtue into a state-sponsored workflow for mass murder. Her desire to return England to Catholicism was not just a wish, it was an administrative mandate. The Marian persecutions were not random acts of mob violence. They were a systematic legal process. The heresy acts were passed by Parliament. Accusations were formally registered. Ecclesiastical courts were convened, complete with prosecutors, judges, and scribes documenting every word. The verdict of guilty was not a moment of passion. It was a bureaucratic outcome. The burning of nearly 300 Protestants at the stake was the final predictable step in a state-sanctioned operational plan. The language used was of purification, cleansing the realm and enforcing compliance. The horror was laundered through law. Across the world, Empress Wu Zetian of China had already perfected this model. To consolidate her power in a deeply patriarchal system, she didn't just eliminate rivals, she created an institution to do it for her. Her secret police were a marvel of sinister efficiency. This was not a gang of thugs, it was an intelligence agency. They operated with official sanction, managing networks of informants, compiling detailed dossiers on perceived threats and using torture as a standard information extraction technique. Loyalty was measured, dissent was cataloged, and elimination was a matter of state security. An official who fell from favor wasn't simply murdered, he was investigated, processed, and removed according to protocol. This is the point where the perpetrator becomes insulated from their own cruelty by layers of administration. The decision is made in a palace chamber, but the bloody work is done by others, justified by a signature on a document. The system incentivizes this brutality. For Wu Zetian's agents and Mary Thorne's magistrates, hunting heretics and traitors was a path to promotion. This creates a feedback loop of terror. Even a single, horrific act of familial violence, like Irene of Athens blinding her own son to secure the Byzantine throne, is framed in this language of cold necessity. He wasn't just her son. He was a political instability, an obstacle to effective governance. His removal was not an act of maternal betrayal. It was an optimization of the line of succession. The water is now simmering, and the bubbles breaking the surface are the lives of those deemed expendable by the system. The final screaming stage is reached when the victims are no longer recognized as human. They are stripped of their identity and reduced to something else entirely: an obstacle, a resource, an abstract threat, or even raw material. The polite labels of the previous stages are burned away, revealing a core logic where the perpetrator's will is the only thing that matters, and a human life is a variable that can be deleted without consequence. The system no longer bothers with the pretense of justice or order. Its sole purpose is the execution of a monstrous will. Enter Queen Ranavalona, the Frere of Madagascar. Her reign was a masterclass in this principle. To purify her nation of foreign influence and Christianity, she didn't just persecute dissenters. She implemented the Tangina ordeal. This was a judicial protocol disguised as divine will. The accused were forced to ingest a poison from the Tangina nut. Survival was proof of innocence. Death was proof of guilt. This wasn't law. It was a biological loyalty test with a fatal error rate. Tens of thousands of her own people were subjected to this ritual. They were no longer subjects to be governed. They were data points in a national purity test, their deaths simply a form of exception handling for the Malagasy state. In America, Belle Gunness applied a similar, albeit more commercial logic. The lonely men who answered her marriage ads were not suitors. They were assets to be liquidated. Her Indiana farm was not a home. It was a processing facility. She would charm them, convince them to sell their property, and bring the cash to her, and then they would be handled. Their bodies were just a byproduct of the transaction, a compliance issue to be managed by burying them in the hog pen. The language of her operation was that of a predator: lure, capture, consume, dispose. The humanity of her victims was irrelevant from the moment they signed their letters to her. This absolute dehumanization reaches its mythical peak with the legend of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. The hundreds of young servant girls she allegedly tortured and killed were not people. They were a renewable resource for a grotesque cosmetic ritual. They were inventory for her castle, their blood nothing more than a therapeutic agent. And this brings us to the ultimate logical conclusion of this terrifying progression: Leonarda Cianciulli. In her kitchen, the final transformation took place. Her three victims were not just killed to satisfy a bizarre, superstitious ritual to protect her son. They were utilized. After their deaths, their bodies were no longer human remains to be hidden, but a collection of useful compounds. One was rendered into soap. The fat of another was mixed into tea cakes. The blood of a third was baked into crunchy biscuits. Here, dehumanization is absolute and literal. A human being becomes an ingredient. The polite labels are gone. There is only the process, the product, and the unblinking, horrifying certainty of the woman who saw nothing wrong. You didn't notice the temperature rising because the labels stayed polite. Duty became purification, and protection became harvest. We have audited the system and mapped the environment. We've seen how the cultural temperature could rise from a comfortable warmth to a furious boil, creating the conditions for atrocity. Now we open the case files. We move from the abstract how to the horrifying what. We will proceed chronologically, not by date, but by an escalating scale of darkness, from the cold calculus of politics to the fever pitch of personal madness. Act A: the setup, betrayal, the politics of power and poison. We begin in the perfumed courts of Renaissance Italy with a woman whose name became a synonym for poison: Lucrezia Borgia. Was she the incestuous, venomous spider at the center of a web of intrigue, or was she the web itself spun by her father and brother to trap their enemies? The official story, written by her family's foes, paints her as a master of the poisoned ring, and the fatal feast. But the forensic evidence is thin. Her true crime may not have been murder, but survival. She was a dynastic asset who learned to outlive her usefulness to one man by becoming indispensable to the next. The curse of Lucrezia Borgia may be that we will never know the woman behind the ink-spilled venom of her legend. Next, we travel north to Tudor England and meet a queen whose piety was as absolute as her power, Mary the Way. History remembers her not as the first undisputed queen regnant of England, but as Bloody Mary. After her predecessor tried to write her out of the line of succession, Mary took the throne with popular support. But her singular mission to return England to the Catholic faith soon became a crusade fought with fire. Heresy laws were reinstated, and the pyres were lit. Nearly 300 Protestants, from bishops to common merchants, were publicly burned at the stake. This wasn't hidden violence. It was theological policy, a terrifying spectacle designed to purify the nation's soul with flame. From public spectacle, we move to the shadows of the Tang dynasty in China and the court of Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule as emperor in her own right. To secure a throne no woman was meant to hold, she built an architecture of fear. Her reign was marked by a sophisticated secret police force, a network of spies and informers that reached into every corner of the empire. Rivals, critics, and even family members who stood in her way were not just defeated, they were erased. They vanished into prisons, were forced into suicide, or were executed on trumped-up charges, their names wiped from the records. A sensible person facing such opposition would retreat. Wu Zetian did not. She built a fortress of paranoia and ruled from its center for 15 years. The violence of the state is one thing, but our final case in this act collapses the political into the profoundly personal. In 8th century Byzantium, the Empress Irene of Athens co-ruled with her young son Constantine VI. But as he grew and demanded true power, Irene made a decision that shattered every known boundary of maternal and political duty. To retain the throne for herself, she orchestrated a conspiracy against her own child. In the very room where he had been born, she had Constantine arrested and his eyes gouged out. The act was so brutal, it was meant to disqualify him from ruling forever. Here, the cold logic of statecraft collapses into the horror of the maternal, proving that the most intimate betrayals are often the most absolute. But political violence, for all its grandeur, operates on a recognizable logic. What happens when the battlefield shrinks from the throne room to the kitchen? When the weapon isn't an army, but a spoonful of sugar? Act B, the downfall, the domestic arsenic age. Welcome to the 19th century, the golden age of arsenic. In the industrial towns of northern England, we meet Mary Ann Cotton. Dubbed Britain's first female serial killer, she was the angel of death who moved from town to town, leaving a trail of small graves behind her. Husband, stepchildren, even her own mother all succumbed to gastric fever. Her true motive was chillingly modern life insurance. She was a pioneer of a new kind of crime, realizing that a small insurance premium could yield a handsome payout. She didn't wield a sword, she wielded a teapot, patiently nursing her victims to death for profit. In the Polish-American ghettos of Chicago, we find a bizarre evolution of this model in Tilly Klimek. Tilly didn't just poison her string of husbands, she predicted their deaths. With a chilling smile, she would tell neighbors that her husband was not long for this world, only for him to perish on schedule. Her prophecies were, of course, self-fulfilled with arsenic. She was the center of a so-called Bluebeard clique, a group of women suspected of using the same method. This wasn't just murder for profit, it was murder as a performance, a grotesque piece of theater where the killer played the roles of both prophet and executioner. But the apex predator of this era was Belle Gunnis, a Norwegian immigrant who turned her Indiana farm into a factory of death. She placed lonely hearts ads in newspapers, luring suitors with promises of a comfortable life. Men would arrive with their life savings ready to start anew. Instead, they were met with an axe or a dose of poison. Their bodies were dismembered and buried in the hog pen, their assets liquidated. The sheer industrial scale of her operation is staggering. The remains of more than a dozen victims were unearthed on her property. She didn't just kill for money, She harvested men, turning human loneliness into her primary source of income. Greed is a motive we can understand, however repellent, but some appetites defy easy categorization. We now leave the realm of the rational and enter the territory of ritual madness and cruelty for its own sake. Act C, the final act, apogees of cruelty in 19th century Madagascar. Queen Ranavalona I ruled with a terrifying isolationist fury. Dubbed the Mad Queen of Madagascar by Europeans, she saw Christianity and foreign influence as existential threats. Her method of purification was the Tangina ordeal. To prove their loyalty, subjects were forced to swallow a poison from a local shrub. If they vomited up 3 pieces of chicken skin administered with the poison, they were innocent. If they died, they were guilty. This divine roulette claimed the lives of up to 20 to 30% of the population in some regions. She didn't just execute her enemies, she turned her entire kingdom into a closed-off laboratory of fear where justice was a function of biology and loyalty was proven by surviving a dose of poison. From a queen's paranoia, we descend into the realm of nightmarish legend with Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Here the historical record blurs with centuries of Gothic folklore. The charges against her are the stuff of horror films, torturing and killing hundreds of young servant girls. The legends claim she bathed in their blood to retain her youth. While historians debate the true number of victims and the veracity of the blood-bathing, the documented testimony from her trial paints a picture of sadistic cruelty on an unimaginable scale. Whether fact or fiction, Bathory has become the archetype of the aristocratic monster, a woman whose cruelty was apparently born not of politics or greed, but of pure, unadulterated pleasure in the suffering of others. And so, we arrive at our final destination in a small Italian kitchen, where all the threads of horror, maternal instinct, ritual, and dehumanization converge in the story of Leonarda Cianciulli. Convinced that human sacrifice was necessary to protect her beloved son from the dangers of World War II, this unassuming housewife murdered 3 of her neighbors. But her crimes didn't end with death. She performed a grotesque form of recycling. One victim was dissolved in caustic soda and turned into bars of soap. The blood of another was drained and baked into chocolate crunches. The fat of the third was rendered and mixed into tea cakes, which she then served to the very neighbors who were wondering where their friend had gone. It is the ultimate horror, not just murder, but consumption. A killer who didn't just dispose of the evidence, but served it for dessert. The what is horrifying enough, but it's in the how and the why that the true curse is revealed. And for that, we must enter the chamber. We have walked through the gallery of horrors, from the whispered rumors of a Borgia court to the steaming cauldrons of an Italian kitchen. The narrative of what happened is a chilling catalog of human cruelty, but to simply label these women as monsters is a conclusion, not an analysis. It's the easy answer that lets us sleep at night. Here in the chamber, we don't do easy. We perform the autopsy. We move beyond the what and dissect the how and the why. The official story is a simple one because it's comforting. It tells us these women were aberrations, moral mutations, glitches in the matrix of human decency. They were witches, sirens, madwomen, exceptions that prove the rule of a gentler, fairer sex. But here at Cursed Chambers, we don't believe in glitches. We believe in code. And the code that produced these outcomes was running long before they were born. To understand it, we must examine the evidence. Let's begin with our domestic killers, Cotton, Klimek, Gunnis. Their crimes seem born of a uniquely personal evil, but they were in fact enabled by the intersection of 2 revolutionary forces. The first was the weapon itself, arsenic. In the 19th century, this was not some exotic poison of assassins. It was an over-the-counter product, the primary ingredient in flypaper and rat killer. It was tasteless, odorless, and its symptoms perfectly mimicked the era's most common fatal illnesses. Dysentery, cholera, gastric fever. It was the great equalizer, a weapon of devastating power that required no strength, only patience, and it was readily available in the one place. A woman ruled, without question, her kitchen. But a weapon is nothing without a motive, and the 19th century provided a motive that was both brand new and brutally effective: the life insurance policy. For For the first time in history, a working-class man's life had a fixed, cashable value. A husband was no longer just a breadwinner. He was a winning lottery ticket waiting to be cashed. For a woman trapped in poverty with no legal rights and no path to financial independence, this system wasn't just a safety net, it was an opportunity. Suddenly, a series of small tragic deaths could become a viable career path. Mary Ann Cotton wasn't just a grieving widow, she was an astute, if monstrous, financial planner. Belle Gunness wasn't just looking for love, she was sourcing capital for her enterprise. The poison bottle provided the how. The insurance policy provided the why. This wasn't madness. It was a dark and twisted form of economic opportunism running on a new and lethal algorithm. Now we turn to our rulers, Mary Wu Irene Ranavalona. If the domestic killer's weapon was the teapot, theirs was the entire apparatus of the state. Their power was not hidden, it was absolute, and their violence was not a crime, but a policy. To understand them, we must discard the idea of chaotic rage and see their actions for what they were: calculated, instruments of control. Mary's pyres were not the acts of a hysterical zealot. They were a tool of state terror designed to crush a political and theological rebellion that threatened her throne and her vision for England. Wu Zetian's secret police were the logical response of a brilliant usurper in a system designed to reject her at every turn. Her purges were preemptive strikes to neutralize threats before they could coalesce. Irene's blinding of her son was the most brutal succession plan imaginable, a permanent solution to a political rival she could not afford to have. And Ranavalona's Tangina ordeal was a terrifyingly effective mechanism of population control, a loyalty test that eliminated dissent with the finality of a biological agent. In every case, the violence was systematic, not spontaneous. It was justified by the language of state security, divine will, and imperial stability. This wasn't a failure of their sanity. It was a feature of their governance. They were trapped in a political game where the only rule was to survive, and they used the most powerful tools at their disposal to win. The curse here wasn't madness, it was the absolute chilling logic of absolute power. Finally, we must examine the narrative itself as a weapon. For figures like Lucrezia Borgia and Elizabeth Bathory, their monstrous reputations are as much a product of ink as of action. Here, the forensic historian must become a literary critic, asking not just what happened, but who told the story and why. The black legend of Lucrezia Borgia, with its tales of incest and poison, was an incredibly effective propaganda tool, wielded by her family's many political enemies. By painting her as a degenerate monster, they could delegitimize the entire Borgia enterprise. Similarly, while Elizabeth Bathory was almost certainly a cruel and abusive aristocrat, the more lurid details of her case, the astronomical body count, the bathing in blood, were solidified during a trial conducted by rivals who stood to gain her vast fortune and lands. The testimony was extracted under duress, and the narrative was shaped to serve a political and financial motive. This exhibit doesn't exonerate them, but it forces us to question the scale of their monstrosity. It reveals how a powerful woman's reputation could be weaponized against her, creating a legend so potent that it obscures the more complicated and perhaps more telling truth. The curse for them was being a canvas onto which their enemies could paint a masterpiece of horror. So what is the cursed chamber in this story? It's not a physical place. It's not a supernatural affliction. It's a formula, an equation for creating a monster. The curse was the systemic powerlessness of their gender, amplified and weaponized by the sudden arrival of a new exploitable system. For Mary Ann Cotton, the flaw was poverty and dependence. The incentive was the life insurance policy. For Wu Zetian, the flaw was her vulnerability as a female usurper. The incentive was the absolute power of the throne. For Leonarda Cianciulli, the flaw was a mother's overpowering fear. The incentive was a warped, superstitious belief in blood sacrifice. The variables change, but the equation remains constant. Each woman found a key that unlocked a door no one thought she could open. The tragedy is that for every one of them, that door led directly into an abattoir. We step out of the analytical chamber, the scent of arsenic and old parchment fading behind us. We have reviewed the evidence, dissected the motives, and exposed the systemic code that ran beneath the chaos. Now we are left in the echo, where the actions of these women reverberate through the centuries, shaping the world we inhabit today in ways we rarely acknowledge. So what is the final verdict on the female monster? The truth, as always, is more complex and far more disturbing than the legend. What we have uncovered is not a legion of identical demons, but a spectrum of human darkness ignited by very different sparks. Some were cold, calculating opportunists. For women like Marianne Cotton and Belle Gunness, murder was a business strategy, a brutal form of entrepreneurship in a world that offered them few legitimate paths to wealth. They were the products of a new economic algorithm, and they exploited it with ruthless efficiency. Others, our queens and empresses, were architects of power. Their violence was not born of greed, but of the existential terror that comes with sitting on a precarious throne. For Wu Zetian and Irene of Athens, cruelty was a tool of statecraft, a necessary if horrifying means of survival in a political arena designed to see them fail. They were not mad. They were playing a deadly game by its deadliest rules. And then there were the true outliers, like Leonarda Cianciulli, whose actions defy any rational explanation of politics or finance. She was driven by a terrifying fusion of maternal love and deranged superstition, a private logic so twisted that it turned her kitchen into an altar for human sacrifice. They were not all the same, but none of them were born monsters. They were forged at the violent intersection of their own character and the unique pressures of their time. The system provided the weapon and the motive. They simply chose to pull the trigger. Their reigns of terror did not end with their deaths or imprisonment. They left scars on the world that forced it to evolve. The domestic arsenic age, for instance, sparked a forensic arms race. As killers like Marianne Cotton perfected the art of the slow poison, science was forced to catch up. The development of the Marsh test in 1836, the first reliable method for detecting arsenic in a corpse, was a direct response to this invisible epidemic. Modern toxicology was born from the need to peer into the graves of these poisoners' victims and make the dead speak. The insurance murders of Gunness and Cotton also forced a systemic patch. Insurance companies, realizing their policies had become macabre incentives for murder, began developing the investigative branches and insurable interest clauses that are standard practice today. They had to rewrite their own code to survive the very predators their system had unintentionally created. And the great dark legends of Bathory and Borgia left a cultural ghost that still haunts us. They became the archetypes of the dangerously powerful woman, the seductress, the schemer, the witch. This narrative, whether true or propagandized, created a powerful template that persists today, subtly shaping how we view and often mistrust women who dare to seek and wield absolute power. In the end, what is the most chilling lesson we can take from these cursed chambers? It is the profound and terrifying banality of their confidence. We look back now, armed with forensic science and modern psychology, and see their actions as monstrous. But they did not see themselves that way. History, it seems, is a logbook of plausible mistakes made with perfect confidence. Mary. I truly believed she was saving the soul of her nation with every heretic she burned. Marianne Cotton likely saw herself as a resourceful widow navigating a brutal world. And Leonarda Cianciulli, in her own warped mind, was performing the ultimate act of maternal devotion. The real horror isn't that they were monsters. The real horror is that their actions made a terrifying kind of sense to them. It reminds us that the moral architecture of any society is shockingly fragile. We condemn their worlds for allowing such atrocities, but we forget to audit our own. So now we turn the final verdict over to you. Who was the most chilling, the cold pragmatist turning death into profit, the ruthless queen securing her throne, or the demented mother serving her victims as tea cakes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Cursed Chambers to unlock more of history's darkest secrets. Because the past is never truly dead, and the most cursed chambers are often the ones we build for ourselves, one plausible mistake at a time.